Hey Milwaukee, and welcome to another installment of Listen MKE, titled Asian Americans Speak Out Against Hate and Bigotry. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Taryn Powell, and I'm the Race and Ethnicity Reporter at WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. Listen MKE is a partnership between WUWM, the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Milwaukee PBS, and the Milwaukee Public Library. Today we're addressing an issue that has, unfortunately, always existed, but over the last year, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, has become more frequent, and that's violence against Asian communities. In early 2020, there was a flood of news about COVID-19, including that the virus first appeared in Wuhan, China. There were white government officials that called it the Chinese virus, among other names, blaming the country and its people for what was happening globally. Some citizens have subsequently reacted violently toward all Asian people. There are examples of this in cities across the country, including right here in Milwaukee and communities across Wisconsin. And there's the latest attack against Asian people in the Atlanta area, where a white man murdered 8 people across 3 spas. 7 were women, 6 of them women of Asian descent. Today, we're going to talk about the rise in anti-Asian discrimination. I'm co-moderating this conversation with my colleague, Daphne Chen, data and investigative reporter at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And we also have Dr. Chia Vang, UW-Milwaukee Interim Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and Professor of History, State Representative Francesca Hong, Wisconsin's first Asian American state legislator, and Lo Neng Kiatoukaysy, Executive Director of the Hmong American Friendship Association. For those of you watching with us, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the comment section throughout our program, and we will try to get to as many as possible. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Daphne to get us started with some questions.
Yes, thank you, Taryn, and thank you to our guests for being here in this space to process everything that has happened and has been happening. I was hoping to maybe first just share a little bit about myself and invite you guys to share a little bit about your background and what your identity, being Asian or Asian American, has meant to you all. Just because for me, it's not always been a comfortable identity. I grew up, the daughter of immigrants from China in Dallas, Texas, in a very white school in a very white suburb. And for me, I think I leaned into the model minority myth, for survival, for acceptance. And so with my family, a lot of it has resulted in trying to reject that culture, trying to reject that identity, being resentful of being sent to school with Chinese food for lunch, or being resentful of having to learn Chinese. And it took me a long time to grow into my identity and realize how much I'd given up to assimilate into American culture. And so it was a little hard for me to process the shootings in Atlanta for all the rise in Asian American violence this year for all of these reasons. So to begin with, your backgrounds and whether you feel the same or differently.
I'll jump in. Thank you so much for sharing that, Daphne. I echo a lot of what you said. I'm born and raised in Madison, Wisconsin. I am a proud daughter of Korean immigrants, so I identify as Korean American. And I think I too leaned into that model minority myth, and achievement was how I measured how much I belonged. A lot of my relationships, I tried to navigate white spaces without thinking too much about my own identity, with the sense that I always felt a little bit like I didn't belong, whether that was on the soccer field, in the hospitality industry, which is my background and has been my professional life for the past 15 years, in the classroom, and in social spaces. I think I've always been either the only woman of color, or the most accessible person of color. And then what that does is not only did that, bring on resentment from my own, resentment to my own identity, I think it really made me try to, I wasn't always aware of the struggles of other communities of color, because for me, assimilation always kind of took over. And so I did marry a proximity to whiteness continues, right? I'm my son is biracial. He's half white and half Korean, and I think navigating, what his identity is and how people perceive him is always at the back of my mind as well. And with this rise in Asian American. With this rise of anti-Asian hate that has always existed, as mentioned before, it's really difficult right now to process how to continue to navigate and really how to represent the diverse voices of Asian lived experiences in Wisconsin, and how best to do that, I think, is to not only lean into my own identity, but really reach out to those diverse lived experiences and know that the Hmong experience, the Vietnamese experience, the Filipino experiences, the vast diaspora of Asian American experiences in this country is really connected and rooted in fighting against white supremacy culture. And I'm hoping that we can discuss that narrative further today.
My name is Lo Neng Kiatoukaysy. I'm the director for the Hmong American Friendship. I'm a product of the Vietnam War. It's been really hard being Hmong in America. My father works for the CIA back in Laos, and during the migration from Laos to Thailand to the United States, mom and 7 kids of us came to America in Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas in 1980. It wasn't until 3 years later, dad came to America. So it was a really kind of tough childhood. And being in Arkansas, very limited exposure to Asian. School was a bit tough there. There was a lot of misunderstanding, or I would say a lot of stereotype from my classmates toward me. And then when I was in high school, I moved to Minnesota. I went to an all-boys school in northern Minnesota, and that was kind of hard too, because back in the late 80s, not too many people in that area are exposed to Asian, and being the only Asian in a small town, 600 people, there's a lot of questions asked. I'm sure it's innocent questions, and sometimes it's hurtful. But I lived with some of those guys for 4 years in a certain prep, and then now we're like brothers and best friends. So I endure quite a bit of stereotyping, and I myself, not so innocent too. I do have stereotype on other race and the past, and as we grow older, we tend to think better, and also in concern of our children, we tend to be better so that we can be a good example of our children. In the incident that happened in Atlanta and also in California, that deeply saddened me, because we all are immigrants to America, and for such tragedy to happen, it kind of brings me back to those days and said, how could we make it better? How can we stop this trend so that it does not continue to go toward all children? Because if we don't stop this trend and our children learn hatred, it's going to build more hatred. So I'm really hoping that there's a way, like my journey, some of my worst enemy will become my best friend or a member of my family in the future. And I'm hoping to turn the worst scenario into the best scenario. And that's why I'm here today.
So I'm Chia Vang, as introduced, and so I just want to say thank you so much for having this conversation. It's a lot for us to talk about now, but I think talking is where we begin. And I think your question about my own identity, my story is similar to Lo Neng, who is a good friend of mine. I came to the U.S. as a refugee as well of the Vietnam War and settled right away in the Twin Cities. So for a lot of kids, my generation who came in the late 70s and early 80s, huge flows of refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to the United States, we were part of this group of refugees who were thrown into inner cities. So what's interesting about my experience is that, I really appreciate hearing Daphne and Francesca's story. I think that I grew up very bicultural. So because there were so many Hmong people in the Twin Cities, I grew up in St. Paul in particular, and I never questioned my identity. I knew who I was. I was very bicultural. kids my generation, refugee kids, we were the first ones to learn English. So we became the voices for our parents. We became the people who interpreted for them. We opened their letters and helped them to make payments. So I never questioned who I was. I was very strong in terms of my Hmong identity. And so I never had that kind of challenge of, figuring out who I was, because I was in a place with a lot of Hmong people, and we were the biggest Asian group in the Twin Cities, like we currently are. So growing up, I didn't question, but what's interesting is that, even though Hmong people, we came after, the social movements of the 60s and 70s. And yes, by the time we came to the United States, the model minority was very much, something that was labeled for Asian Americans. But for us as a refugee group, where we did not fit the model minority very neatly, but many of us also worked very hard and really believed in, being able to advance ourselves through education. So that's kind of where I think that, some of us, I never see myself better than anybody. And in fact, I think as Hmong Americans, we often are treated as the kind of the Asian group that messes up the model minority. So in fact, some of the tensions I experienced growing up is that other Asian Americans who fit the model minority better than my community have often, looked down on us too. So we have to kind of address not just, interracial bigotry, but there was also a lot of intra-racial tensions that I experienced as well. So we can talk a lot more about, processing, but just a word about what happened in Atlanta. As the person who's responsible for so many things here on campus in terms of our anti-racist trainings and, helping the campus community to be a safe space for all community members, all students and faculty and staff. For my first reaction was always that it was really hard for me to process too, but so many people depend on me. So many people email, what can we do? I was struggling too, but I can't be in that struggling mode only because I was responsible for supporting so many people. So the last week has been hard, but hard in the way that it has helped many more people to mobilize that weren't a part of, the conversation. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
I want to thank you all for sharing the struggles that you had growing up and navigating your identity. You definitely as well, all of you guys. Thank you for sharing that with all of us watching. And I want to go back to Atlanta. It's been touched on a little bit, but I'd like each of you to just talk about how you are still processing what happened in Atlanta. Like what has helped you? What are you still grappling with? Dr. Vang, I'll send it back to you.
Sure. I mean, the way what's happened to how I'm processing this is that I've heard from a lot of people too in how my life has changed, right? In the past, as a person of Hmong descent, living in Wisconsin now and then previously Minnesota, I would have to say that I have always been aware of my identity. That Hmong Americans or Asian Americans here in Wisconsin, I've always been really aware where I go, what I do, and with be the mother of two young Hmong sons, I'm every day now encouraging them when they go out. The COVID was already bad enough, right? Where I was already telling them, don't do this, don't do that. This is how you respond if somebody says something to you. But after the Atlanta shooting, it's made me even more, not just for myself, but for my, for my family and my students and, my colleagues, just we're all just trying to better understand why we are so afraid, right? We're so afraid because it can happen anywhere. And it has happened in spaces that you never think it would happen. So for me, it has been really troubling because now I and my colleagues and other Asian people of Asian descent, we're afraid to walk down the block without being aware. We're going to the grocery store. You're thinking about, okay, I have to make sure, is somebody watching me? I'm just much more aware than I've ever been before. I was before, but so much more now than ever.
Francesca.
It's so difficult to process what happened in Atlanta. It's always difficult to make sense out of senseless violence. I think for me, it's been helpful to recognize that we can't look at the shooting or isolated incidents as individualized incidents, that something like this, and when there's such a media blitz and we all have to kind of mobilize and organize to take a step back and really kind of look at what are some of the larger factors that have contributed to this. And as Chia mentioned before, you know, reflecting back on history. And what I've come to understand more and really feel on a more lived experience level now is just how much this country relies on people of color to hold burdens and to navigate with burdens, and how that, you know, it's a constant balance of figuring out when you're scared and when you're angry, and what those emotions, projecting those emotions is going to, what consequences there's going to be from that. And so it's been incredibly difficult, and I found that I'm able to ground myself in discussions, in conversations, and having more of these. For the first time, we held space for Korean Americans in Madison to come have a talk about racial identity, because I don't remember ever having this conversation with my parents growing up. But now I'm scared for them. I don't want them to go to Costco. I don't want to, you know, I don't like that I feel scared walking down the street. But I know that these types of fears, unfortunately, are so common among so many communities right now. So where I'd like to start asking deeper questions. I'd like more people to start looking at root causes. I want to get away from identity policy talks and really have honest conversations about identity. And so the process, I think, for me, is about collective grief and collective solidarity, and then working together towards solution, and everyone recognizing that it is really going to be an all cylinders firing all the time, sustained advocacy that we all need to take responsibility to be a part of in order to find those solutions.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. And I think, you know, you bring up parallels, of course, just me being a Black woman, in the whole movement we've seen, especially in 2020, of Black people demanding to stop being murdered for simply walking down the street. You know, we recognize being followed in certain places, right? Wondering if someone's gonna, I don't know, look at you weird, act towards you weird, you know? So Black folks are well aware of that. And I know you guys are familiar with that as well. So when we talk about having those conversations with all communities of color about navigating racial identity, we definitely have a ton in common. And so the next part of my question, I'll send it to you, Lo Neng, because I think you kind of touched on this a little bit in your first answer. You know, how did we get to this moment, to Atlanta, to the moment in California? What contributed to this?
You know, I'm still kind of shaken and shocked by it. You never think that you will see something like this in the United States today. It's like a roller coaster. It just doesn't stop. With Black Lives Matter, the protests, and it rolls into the Asian. It's saddening to see. The question is that what are we going to do to stop this? This is crazy. At the same time, it makes me angry. At the same time, I want to reach out and educate people. I want to reach out and share people that there's a way to communicate with each other than doing all this kind of crazy stuff. You know, with this tragedy, I think indirectly it really brought fear to myself and to my family and to my community. Just Sunday, I went to brunch in West Bend, and you know, even though they're really nice people, it's all white community, and I went to have brunch there. You cannot help it. You're thinking that people are looking at you. Because all the media displaying all the, you know, all the news, social media, all these about anti-Asian hate crime and things like that. And you're even people don't think if you don't think badly of us, sometimes we project it like, oh my God, they're looking at us. Oh my God, what should we say? Should I have my kids quiet down and things like that? It creates such an uncomfortable atmosphere. And I'm really hoping that there's a way that we can communicate better, talk better, learn from each other, so that way things like this do not happen, and that we can live freely in America. It should be a land of milk and honey. It should be a land of freedom, that people are comfortable. And I'm really glad to be in America from Laos. It's such a huge difference. I'm hoping that my kids' generation, that things like this do not happen. I know that in a society there will always be something, but not this magnitude. And I pray for the family in Atlanta and also in California as well.
Thank you. Daphne?
Yeah, this is a good time to maybe expand on something I think Francesca touched on earlier, which is, maybe unpacking some of the historical or the systemic roots of this kind of racism. Like, I don't know if any of you guys want to talk about factors like gender, class, all these things that are intersecting with this incident. Maybe Chia, from being professor of history, can educate us a bit.
Sure. I mean, thank you for that question, because I like to think that we are better today, right? We'd like to think that we've come so far and we should be better. But it is really important for us to better understand the history of anti-Asian violence, and every time we talk about how, oh, this shouldn't happen, or I can't believe this happened, I'm always just reminded that our country was built upon tremendous challenges that really looked at one group as more valuable than everybody else. So the history of systemic racism and the history of how our institutions are built, and the history of, so many people who look like me and those who are not socially defined as white, how people weren't treated as human beings for a very long time. And you look at the ability to vote, and you look at all the challenges that we still have, then when you think about how, it's not, Francesca said something earlier that I think it's really important for us to remember too, that it's not just individuals, racist individuals who commit these crimes, but what about the systems and institutions that sort of allow some of these things to continue to take place. And I think that unless we address some of these systemic issues, it's going to be hard to change people's hearts and minds. I happen to think that we have more information than we ever do right now, right? People know. In the past, we can blame how people aren't educated. They don't know about slavery. They don't know that, that they don't know this, they don't know that. But nowadays, I mean, we know so much in so many ways, but I don't know if knowledge itself, right, has really been able to bring the results that we want. So I think until people who don't look like us, until people who have the power to make systemic changes, make the commitment to make those changes, I think we're going to continue to face these similar issues. So it's not just about race, right? It's about class. It's about people fearing, Asian labor. And, of course, the Asian model minority has been, discussed earlier. But I think that one of the reasons why, categories like that are created are also to, I often talk to my staff and my students about how the people at the bottom fight for the crumbs, right? If you have the people in the bottom who don't have power fighting against each other, then they're not really addressing the systemic issues. So poor white communities, they experience the same kinds of economic challenges that many communities of colors do as well. But whiteness allows people to have a certain kind of privilege that the rest of us don't. So I think until we are willing to address these systemic issues, we might continue to live in this challenging world. And I do want a better world for my children as well. But I think that, people who have the power to do something must do something. It can't be every time there's an incident that we come together, we talk about it, we try to heal together. But it's these actionable things that we need to take that will change not just hearts and minds, right? But resources for communities as well.
If I could just, that was all in something I think, you know, we all need to really consider sharing all of the time, in that when communities are pitted against each other, when we don't recognize that white supremacy impacts white people as well, that if we continue to be complacent in thinking that representation is enough, we will never get better. Representation is not enough. Race, class narratives and racial identity and education about the role of race in the history of this country needs to be ubiquitous in the educational institutions, need to be ubiquitous in political systems. We have to concurrently shift culture in order to shift laws and regulations. And I think that you know, being the first, a lot of people ask me about that, and I always answered with, it's nothing unless I'm the last. And I think that I think that it's incredibly important that we continue to recognize that, you know, we are at the intersection of race, class, gender. All of this violence is perpetuated because we live in such a scarcity mindset, and it pits communities against each other. And we must be able to overcome that narrative by recognizing that it can be better. We can choose to make this better, but it's everyone's responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Francesca and Dr. Vang, for those answers. I wanted to remind everybody watching that you are watching Listen MKE, a partnership between WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Milwaukee PBS, and the Milwaukee Public Library. Our event today is called Asian Americans Speak Out Against Hate and Bigotry, and our guests have been sharing their journeys with self-identity and how we got to the moment in Atlanta, in California, moments in Wisconsin, where people have chosen to act racist and prejudicial toward Asian people. And so I'll take the next question here as we talk about, you know, actionable changes and bringing everyone together. Francesca, I'll send it back to you since you are on the lawmaking level. You know, what can be done to, excuse me, fight back individually and structurally?
So I think a couple things, well, a lot of things need to happen. And when I talk about all cylinders firing, I really do mean that. And I think, you know, one of the most impactful ways is for those who have power in terms of creating the budgets. Budgets are moral documents, right? That we really recognize when we talk about the work and the organizing, that we recognize organizers and community leaders who have been helping their communities, who have been suffering and fighting for the crumbs for a long time, and giving them financial agency and making sure that they have, you know, abilities to create their own infrastructure. I think we think too much about, you know, not being able to have direct impact. We can if we seek out the leaders who have been doing that work for a while. And so I'm going to continue to advocate to make sure that financial decisions recognize the power of grassroots organizations and community leaders who have relationships with neighborhoods who are most impacted. I think we need to make sure that, you know, we can do simple statutory changes. I've introduced I'll be introducing legislation to add Asian Americans to school curricula when in terms of, you know, adding us on to American Indians, Black Americans, and Hispanics in terms of citizenship requirements for what needs to be in curriculum for school boards, you know, going back to making sure that talking about racial identity and the role of race is ubiquitous in classrooms. And that, you know, people don't see that type of change as a threat, that this really will help us all get out of this scarcity mindset and recognize that it's important to value all humans right now. And then, you know, I think legislatively, in the legislature, there needs to be cultural shifts in making sure that it's not just the leaders and the representatives of color that are leading this call for action against racist policies, that we really do need more training for legislators as well when it comes to anti-racist work, that we need our legislators, who we hear back from folks who are in swing districts or difficult districts, that we want to be mindful of that, but we also need to know that this work relies on them speaking out too. And so speaking out against anti-Asian hate, I don't think should be political, but it's become politicized due to previous administrations creating that narrative. So it's on us to really change that.
You know, one of the things I think that is really important is that for politicians and government to really understand our community. At the same time, in the Hmong community or during get out to vote or election, as politicians, they always come to our community and say, vote for me, I'll do this and that. We really need to hold government accountable, a leader accountable for what they're saying, what they're gonna do for our community. I think it's really important. Our community needs to be educated that the power of voting is important, not just vote because your relative want you to vote for this and that person, but because what you believe in that person and what person will do for your community as a whole. You know, as a nonprofit organization, I strongly believe in grassroots, and I strongly believe that we need to educate our community to get out to vote. It's such an impactful thing in having a U.S. citizen. It's not, it should be a miracle, a right to be able to vote for an individual that is going to come through to you. And I do call for government accountability and leadership accountability, because when you are a leader, what you say will impact your community, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm just educating our community to the extent that you should really get out to vote, and grassroots is really important.
Absolutely. Just one note of that. I completely support that notion that we cannot just be going to these communities every 2 years and every 4 years. And when we know that our vote is really can make a difference in so many elections. And I think it's important that legislators understand that the folks going back to their communities, trying to get folks engaged and letting them know the importance of voting, they need things to go back to their communities to be able to help gain that support. We cannot just be a party about what we are voting against. We need to make sure that we are leaders who stand up and are giving you something to fight for. And that's absolutely on accountability of elected officials. And I agree that we cannot continue this notion of going back to communities of colors every two to 4 years and not being able to show anything for it.
That's so interesting to hear. For me, it makes me think of my parents and discussions I've been having with them about political engagement. And, you know, I think especially my mom being the generation that she is, and having seen so much tumultuous change in China, she's never really felt like her voice mattered, I think, that her vote would matter, that she could affect change here. And often has, you know, they've taught me to kind of work hard, keep your head down, and people will recognize when you do well, and to just kind of be quiet and don't speak up too much. And so I think like this event and a lot of things that have happened recently have brought them out a little bit and kind of encouraged them to take up more space and speak up. And I think that's part of why like these discussions are so helpful, because a lot of my processing has been done in silence or by myself, and it's very nice to talk to other people and to come together and just speak out.
You know, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Lo Neng.
Oh, you know, one thing that I do want to add is that fighting for crumbs. I've been a nonprofit for over 25 years, and I see a lot of, I don't know, they put an RFP out there, small agency, we're fighting for crumbs, and kind of really divide us. One of my philosophy in life is that you do not fight with all the agency. There's got to be a better way to work things out. There are things that you could do better. There's things that all the agents could do better. by leveraging the resources, you can help directly provide service to your community. But I notice that a lot of funders out there, they like to pitch us against each other. And I think we have to realize that and say, hey, listen, I'm not gonna fight with my another nonprofit organization for that resource. Perhaps maybe I can work better with them in putting a proposal together, or maybe just stay away from it if it's not something I'm good at. And I think that by recognizing it, by doing that, it brings us all together, because resource funding does split us apart and does allow us to fight with each other. And to me, that's not productive at all.
I was just going to say that, you know, your question about what needs to change and what can be done, I think that we really have to be able to not see people as so different from us. I think so often that has been the case, right? Where if a black child is injured, you know, I should be in pain for that black child. And same for, you know, another person who doesn't look like me. If I'm hurt, that they should feel the pain too. So I think that so often we hurt when it's people who look like us. That's been, I think, one of the biggest challenge in our society. And that's why even like in the Asian American community, you know, when many did come out, many are part of Black Lives Matter movements around the country too, and, you know, our Hmong community as well. But it shouldn't be just us having these conversations in these spaces. We have to have more, again, intra-group conversations are really important. We need safe space to process and heal and mourn. But we also need those spaces where we're speaking with our colleagues in other, you know, racial communities, because it's about safety and a good, healthy life for our community members across racial, ethnic, gender lines, instead of hurting only when it's people who look like us. That's been, I think, one of the things I have been thinking a lot about, is that with the Atlanta killing, why, you know, it'd be good for other people who don't look like us, who don't look like the, you know, the people who were killed, to also be out expressing anger and rage as well, instead of, again, us only mobilizing when it's somebody who looked like us. So maybe just rethink those kinds of, you know, how we see other people. And white supremacy is, you know, very, very important. But I feel like the rest of us, we have to have more coalition building across the different groups, that it's a battle for all of us. It can't just be isolated, you know, small battles. It's a larger war that we have to fight together. And the only way we can make some movement is, I say this from a very personal level. Can we hurt, you know, can you feel pain when it's people who don't look like you? Until we do so, then I think it's going to be really hard for people to come together. So I challenge all of us to do that.
Yes, and I think that's a great time to mention that we're planning a second segment soon to deal specifically and talk specifically about tensions between, you know, the Asian and the Black community, racism within groups of people of color, which is a very complex, complicated topic, and, you know, we probably can't unpack today. But even just today, we've gotten a couple of comments through the Facebook page about this topic. For example, somebody asking, where were you when Black people were murdered for no reason? Now it hits home. And so I think that touches exactly on what you're talking about, Chia. Mm-hmm. Another question that we wanted to talk to you guys about is, what is media leaving out of covering this story? I think it's been a difficult topic to cover well, and perhaps media hasn't been fully equipped. So we would just love to hear your perspective on that.
I know it's difficult media itself is so broad, right? But with all of these different tools that we have right now and folks being hyper engaged on so many different platforms, I think I wish the coverage that really looked at the intersection of gender violence and working class women, especially working class Asian women, kind of elevating those stories and really talking about how that's all rooted in a culture that has devalued them and the horrific history of violence against Asian women that's tied directly to colonialism, imperialism. When I listen to longer podcasts or conversations like this one that really try to touch on how this is all connected. I wish there was more of that elevated. And I think it's important to recognize that, if we just focus on the names of the dead and the perpetrator, what that does is, again, it individualizes the incident as opposed to looking at the problems in our current culture and the steps and the conversations we ought to be having at all the different levels, as Chia mentioned before.
That's a good time to actually bring up one of the comments we just got, which is from somebody named Joe. And, he wrote, "This is more race BS. This man went to get sex, got turned away, and went nuts. It was nothing to do with race." I think that's a really common, theme that's out there. So just curious if anybody would like to.
Yeah, this man drove across multiple counties and went directly to massage parlors run by Asian people in primarily Asian communities. That cannot negate the fact that this was racially motivated, and the fact that when in our history of colonialism and imperialism, what happens is primarily white men and men tend to use Asian women because they're seen as docile and obedient. There is a history of sexualization there and how it's created fetishes. The media also has a role to play in this and in how Asian women are portrayed in movies and stories. That all feeds into a narrative that an individual like the perpetrator has in his head. And so to say it was not racially motivated is incredibly concerning and really takes away from the fact that this yes, every murder is targeted, but this one in particular, we know for a fact that it absolutely was, it was racially motivated, and nobody drives to different massage parlors just looking for sex, and then to think that it was, not because of a culture that has been surrounded, that has, constantly compounded violence against Asian women. I think that's really unfortunate that people are thinking that. And I know that a lot of people do. I've had colleagues in the legislature respond to my resolution about condemning anti-Asian hate, saying that there was not sufficient evidence that it was racially motivated, but I don't really know how much more evidence you need than someone driving across counties, targeting Asian-run massage parlors in Asian communities. And I believe the population of Korean women in Atlanta is quite low as well. So that doesn't quite add up, and I would disagree with that firmly.
Mm-hmm. I would just like to add that everything to what Francesca just said is so important. And the comment, again, that's very typical of many people highlighting that it was not race. But I also want to say that we must really remember that there is this perception that all massage parlors or salon that they're people who are sex workers, and that is absolutely not the case. If you look at what they were, their business, I think it's really important to also remember that these are very vulnerable, labor spaces, right? These are people who work in very difficult, workplaces, and so they're vulnerable. And to me, for someone to say that race had nothing to do with it, I really would like to challenge them to kind of think about that more, because you look at so many of women and women of color in particular working in those spaces, not because that's where they want to work, but they're some of the last resorts for people to earn a living. So that's all I will say. I think it's just disheartening. From the very beginning, you asked a question about the media, and when the police, right away, points to this person who has a sex problem, and that's why he wanted to eliminate these. That already, from the very beginning, sets off a path that we, in so many ways was really unbelievable for me, for someone to do that at the beginning before any investigation has been done. So again, the white individual, the white male, is privileged and has the, based on one interview or their interview of the individual, then they've already drawn the conclusion. And that's problematic for me to think about. So for many of us, it's clear that it was racially motivated. And this is probably where we need to begin, right? And then why can't others not see it at all, right? It's just really amazing that something so clear could be thought of as completely not related to race. It's not imaginable.
Again, just a quick note on adding to how important it is to look at the conditions that are driving people's behaviors and driving people's circumstances and creating their environments. I just want to acknowledge that, yes, low-wage laborers are incredibly vulnerable, especially during these pandemic times as well. But sex work is still work, and that labor needs to be acknowledged. And these women, they went to work to support their families. I mean, some of them were single moms, some of them were in good family homes. Some choose this labor, others are that is their happen of their circumstance. But these were laborers in America, Americans who went to work and were violently murdered because of the way they look.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone can agree this is a conversation that cannot just end after today, because there's just so much more that we could get at. But we are coming close to the time where we, have to end this conversation. But I wanted to plug again that we will return to this in a conversation in the coming weeks. But I wanted to, ask all of you, when we talk about media, especially social media, and we talked about people being so hyper engaged with everything that's going on, and on social media, there was there are posts, there are hashtags, Stop Asian Hate. I want to know what you guys think the movement on social media can add to the conversation. Dr. Vang, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think that's, I'm so pleased to see so many people engaged, right, on social media. But I also hope that it's not just sitting in our homes and engaging in social media, that we do take action when we're out in the field, when we're going shopping, all of us, we need to take care of each other. And that I think it's really important to not just be aware, but then to be willing to take some action. So I'll just leave it with that. It is an incredibly difficult time for everyone in the country globally. But when you add, another layer of anti-Asian hate in particular, but all the other, incidents as well, it makes it a very, very intense moment for us to exist. And I think for me, again, social media is great, but it can't just, be in social media. That people have to take action on the ground, in our spaces, in our neighborhoods. We can't be complicit.
Lo Neng?
When I think of media, TV, news, and things like that, usually bad news are good. To me, I wish that social media would portray more successful news, positive news to be good news, so that way we can directly or indirectly affect people to think positively. Sometimes it's not, sometimes we should feature good news. I'm serious, to really showcase that there are good in our community, there's good in our society too, so that way we just don't run to bad news and things like that. So,
And Francesca?
You know, advocacy and looks very different, and folks have to engage in the ways that they are able to. I'm glad that social media has increased engagement, but I echo what what Dr. Vang and Lo Neng said, that it's important to stay positive, but it's important to get out and take action as well. I encourage folks to not let this fizzle out, to not let Black Lives Matter, stop anti-Asian hate, pro-immigration policy, things that are really impacting people's everyday lives right now, to not make this a trend. Racism is not trendy. Racism has been around for years, and it's going to continue regardless of how many administration changes there are. So it's important that we support one another and make sure that this is sustained advocacy, that we stay loud, that we hold one another accountable, but also take moments to reflect on our own internal biases and recognize that each one of us has the potential to be better, and collectively as communities need to be stronger, and we can get there, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take, again, sustained advocacy. Do not let racism, do not let Black Lives Matter, do not let Stop Asian Hate just be a flavor of the month. We have to make sure that we continue to organize.
I think we only have a couple minutes left, and so I was hoping to end on a positive note, and to also celebrate the Asian community here. So just wanted to give everybody an opportunity to maybe share something beautiful or something joyous about your Asian identity, about experiences you've had out of this tragedy. I know for me, it's opened so many doors with my family to talk about some really deep issues that we never really have before. And it has been beautiful watching, people in my family from different generations who grew up in a different culture grow close to the younger generation that grew up, American or Asian American, and to see that love and that reaching out shine through despite a lot of distance and a lot of trauma that we've been through respectively. So I just wanted to open up the floor to you guys to share something positive if you wish.
I'll go ahead. My sister is actually Jewish, and we have been fortunate to really become a family of interfaith. And I think, it has helped us see one another and believe in each other more. And so I think just this notion of respecting and loving each other's cultures can come out of times of crisis. And I encourage everyone to take opportunities to, celebrate a different culture and find beauty in other faiths. Because I think that intersectionality really can help us move conversations and see good in one another.
Well, I have to say that it's been hard, but the positive thing is that when this incident occurred, we got quite a bit of supporters from the community at large, funders, neighborhood community members calling in, doing project together. Just an example, just this weekend we did a planting gardening project where kids would take seedling or plant home and learn about how to plant it, things like that. And this happens with African American community, with the Hmong community. And I think it's beautiful for people to come together to do a project, to learn from each other, because the more we learn more about each other, we're not much different, and we learn how to get along better. So definitely it's positive when people are coming together to do things together.
I just want to echo that too. We started this conversation with me saying how fearful I was, but just so people know, I am fearful of the environment and the place in which we live, and the fact what I fear most is that we don't continue to make change to create a better world for ourselves. But I do want to say that I am not, sitting at my home and being afraid. I am out doing things. And one positive thing that I think, it wasn't just this incident. It's been in the making for a long time now, but in particular on campus, we are, for the first time ever, we have a anti-racist, anti-bias training that's going on for the whole campus. And it's not perfect, but every employee at the university is going through that now. And I was a part of the team that created this curriculum for our campus. And we are not where we want to be, but I feel hopeful that we are continuing on this journey to make it a better campus for ourselves and for future students. And then if UWM is a better place for everyone, I think it'll benefit the community as well. So that's something that I think is a positive step that the university has taken.
Thank you so much to our guests for joining us today for Listen MKE, Asian Americans Speaking Out Against Hate and Bigotry. And thank everybody for watching. Listen MKE is a partnership between WU, WM, Milwaukee's NPR, the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Milwaukee PBS, and the Milwaukee Public Library. Thank you all so much.